Well, when all was said and done, this came down to a 15-lap sprint to the end. Max Verstappen leading the race in the Red Bull on hard Pirellis. Carlos Sainz in the Ferrari, also on hard Pirellis, P2. First time we've seen Ferrari have a significant, not large, but significant advantage over the Red Bull in terms of top speed. And also a grip advantage for Carlos as well, because his tyres were 6 laps newer than those of Max. So it came down to Max, brilliant in defence. Carlos, really good in attack, very good at charging the engine as well, very good at using the DRS zones, but never got quite close enough actually to pull off any sort of pass on Max. Going into the last lap, or on the last lap, Max in the second last chicane got a little bit of understeer mid-corner, just kept his foot in it, ran a little bit wide with lock on the car, but unusual to see Max like that. But that just shows the commitment and effort it was, I suppose, because he wasn't that far from the wall on the exit, and he had perfect braking down into the hairpin, as he had been for the entire 15-lap stint, and won the Canadian Grand Prix. Really good win for Max on a day, as I say, when he didn't have a top speed advantage. Very unusual. First time we've seen that this year, when he wasn't able to play with a top speed advantage, and Ferrari had that on this occasion. So excellent drive. Carlos Sainz, very good as well. He had a very different strategy to get to that point behind the safety car, that 15-lap sprint. He had stayed out on his mediums for 20 laps, avoiding 2 opportunities during virtual safety cars to come in and change, whereas Max, like Lewis Hamilton, who'd been P3 in the Mercedes, came in at the first virtual safety car on lap 10, which was induced by Sergio Perez pulling up and stopping side of the circuit with a clunk, a little bit like Carlos Sainz's in Baku, which was a hydraulic failure. So it sounded like a hydraulic failure 2022 spec on the Sergio Perez car, but can't be sure. Anyway, those two came in. Carlos didn't, stayed out. And when the final safety car came, you thought this is a really big opportunity for Ferrari and Carlos now. I have to say, I was convinced they were going to put the medium tyre on Carlos for that last stint. And I'm amazed, if I think about it, I'm still amazed they didn't. I know the reason they didn't. I'm sure they didn't, because he only had one set of new tyres, medium tyres, going into the race, and it would have meant putting on scrub tyres, and he did have a new set of hards, and that's probably what swung it in the favour of the hard tyre. But in my view, he would have finished second anyway on the medium tyre, so why wouldn't they have just given that a go, just to see with additional grip that he might have put a little bit more pressure on Max? I may be wrong about that. I mean, who am I to say that the Ferrari strategists know less than I? I'm sure they know exactly what they're doing. But I was surprised that they didn't. Quite a lot of other teams and cars did go onto the medium for that last stint, and it worked pretty well. Not the least of which, of course, was on Charles Leclerc's car. He started from the back of the grid and finished 5th and crossed the line with his mediums in really good shape, still going well and putting pressure, and a few more laps probably would have caught the 2 cars in front of him. The 2 Mercedes, not in the order we've got used to, George Russell, Lewis Hamilton, but Lewis Hamilton, George Russell, which meant that Lewis was on the podium. Great to see Lewis on the podium. He looked like the guy that had almost won his first Grand Prix, as he did indeed in Canada back in 2007. 15 long years ago? I don't know. But Lewis drove really well, very good in attack, very good the way he thought through the race. There were moments when he had to look after the tyres early on with a heavy load of fuel, but certainly much happier now that I guess they've got a slightly higher ride height on the Mercedes. There wasn't significant bouncing on the car, and because of that, it was a more drivable car. Lewis is able to do more with it, and he got out of it looking like a racing driver again, which was really good to see. We didn't see today the real implications of the new FIA screed, in which they're going to monitor ride heights and wear rates on the floor and the skid plates, but certainly the teams looking as if they're going in the direction of this is the ride height that we're pretty comfortable with running. And of course, it may well be that has also reduced Red Bull's margin of performance. We'll see going into the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, but there's certainly a very different looking Red Bull on race day today compared with that we've seen earlier in the season. But Lewis Hamilton, getting back to him, looked really good in the car, and the 15-lap sprint began behind the safety car with Lewis talking to his engineers about what tyres is Charles Leclerc on, what have I got to do to beat Charles, should I have been on the medium tyre like Charles, because that occurred to him as well. And they said, no, Lewis, you got the pace on the hard tyre. Now, it could well be that Ferrari thought that Carlos had the pace on the hard tyre as well, but I still think it would have been worth that flip of the coin, as I say. Anyway, Lewis drove beautifully, finished 3rd, beating George Russell, ahead of George Russell. Beating's probably the wrong word, because George drove really well too, made a really good start, picked up places off the line. The only thing really that beat George ultimately was top speed disadvantage that he had alongside Lewis. So there were a lot of disparities between top speeds today in Canada, which I think is a function of the wet qualifying session yesterday. But for example, George was slower in a straight line than Lewis. The Red Bull was slower than it normally is. Carlos Sainz had a slight top speed advantage over Max. And the Alpine, similarly, which finished 6th and 7th, didn't finish in the order Alonso-Ocon, which is what you would have thought after qualifying, but the other way around, because Fernando's top speed was absolutely terrible as well. Although in this instance, the main problem was with the PU. Fernando was obliged after 20 laps to turn down the power, which made him much slower on the straight, although there was also an aerodynamic difference between his car and that of Esteban in the race. So an all-round frustrating day for Fernando. The two Alfas, 8th and 9th, Valtteri Bottas ahead of Guanyu Zhou, both drove well. Valtteri, I thought, drove very well. Having had a sort of fairly desultory weekend so far, was right back into it in the race, did some good passing and looked very professional and polished, I thought, throughout the race. And Guanyu Zhou in the points again. And Lance Stroll drove pretty well from the back as well. He had a terrible practice like Sebastian Vettel yesterday. Drove pretty well on a two-stop strategy, started on the hard tyre, then switched to the medium and got the final point. Not a good day for McLaren, not a good day for Sebastian Vettel, and not a good day for Mick Schumacher, who was going really well early on, kind of held position off the line, looking for a top 10 finish, and he also ground to a halt, which also looked a little bit like one of those Baku spec hydraulic failures. So that was a Canadian Grand Prix, a very, very good win for Max Verstappen. When I do the Twitch live stream, I'll do another one early next week. A lot of people, some people are saying, oh, well, championship's over. Do we need to watch this anymore? Max Verstappen's obviously going to win the championship. And I think you're probably right. It's looking like a pair of back-to-backs for Max Verstappen and Red Bull. But there are a lot of nuances to this championship still. Here in Canada, to me, it was a surprise to see how quick the Ferraris were in a straight line. And we see Mercedes now on the rise and rise. Two really good drivers. Lewis back where he belongs, really, and that's a good thing going into the British Grand Prix at Silverstone in 2 weeks' time. But for now, it was a great Canadian Grand Prix, great finish, an example of how you don't need a lot of overtaking for it to be a great motor race, point to remember. And we look forward, of course, to Silverstone in 2 weeks' time. Great to be back in Canada, great to be back in Montreal at the circuit Gilles Villeneuve. That's all for now. Look forward to seeing you again soon.